We'll be turning in your Bibles over to 1 Kings chapter 4. 1 Kings chapter 4 is what we're going to be studying tonight. I think the fellows got all the sheets handed out. So we're not going to read the first part of this chapter because there's mainly just a lot of names that are in the first part of the chapter, but it deals with the establishment of Solomon's reign and kind of the people that he appointed to oversee some of those things. And basically, it's summed up, I think, there in verse 1. It says, "So King Solomon was king over all Israel." And as you look, I don't know if you read beforehand, but I want you to take just a few moments here and look through those first 6 verses. And let's talk about some of the positions of leadership that were constituted under Solomon's reign concerning the nation of Israel. It's kind of interesting because, there's really nowhere in the Bible where you read about the way that the government of Israel was set up, all the officials that ruled under it. So it's kind of interesting to read a little bit about these people that were appointed by Solomon, kind of see some of the governmental structure of Israel. So what are some of the positions that stand out? There's actually 8 of them there in those first 6 verses.
Princes, priests.
Okay, yeah, these were the princes that Solomon appointed, and that word kind of in the King James Version has a dual-fold meaning because it basically just means the head. And so these were kind of the head officials, you might say, or the chief officials that Solomon appointed. The first one that you read about is the priesthood, right? So you had one main priest, and I guess the first thing that you probably need to establish if you're Israel is your national religion, right? And make sure that's fortified and in place, because that's what all your laws and your kingship and everything else is based upon. And so the first one that we read about is the office of the priesthood. What else? Okay, there's a recorder that's mentioned in the latter part of verse 3. Anybody have any idea what that was or what that office involved? Well, you would think, by the way it's translated, wouldn't you, that his job was to record something, but that was actually more the scribe's job. And the job of the recorder was probably something like we would think of a herald, a person who went before announcing the king. We might even say the royal announcer at, when a guest would show up at the palace, or when Solomon would go somewhere, or it was the guy that would run before and basically provide information. What else do you read about? What we got, 2 of them?
Scribes.
Okay, the scribes. And what would have been their role? Yeah, they were basically what we would probably think of in a modern day secretary, right? Their job was to write stuff down, to record, to write the king's words, to write down laws, to inform. And so their job was that more like what we would think of a secretarial role today. What else we got? There's 3 of them.
General.
Yeah, what verse are we looking at here? Which one?
Number 4, verse 4 there. Was over the host.
Yeah, so you got basically a commander of the entire army. He was over the entire host of Israel, or the entire army of Israel. And so you have the commander of the army. What are some of the other people? We're halfway there. Yeah, officers that are what? What would you think they would be? Yeah, we're going to read about these 12 different officers. I think, in fact, in verse 7 through 19, that's the next list that you read about. And then you had the son of Nathan here, who was over the entire 12 officers, who were basically the country was divided up into 12 different sections, not necessarily tribes, but sections. And one of these officers was in charge of each section. So you had a man who was over the officers in verse 4 there, Azariah the son of Nathan. Okay, who else do you read about, or what other office?
Somebody was over his household.
Yeah. Yeah, over the household, we might say over the palace, right? Somebody was in charge of all the affairs that went on in the king's palace or where the king lived. That's 6 of them, 2 more that we need.
About the king's friend.
Yeah, the king's friend. What would be another good description for that? Remember some of...
Principal officer.
Do what?
Principal officer.
Principal officer? Okay. So what was his job?
I want trustworthy advice from.
Yeah, he's, when we studied a little bit about David, remember he had these people who were close to him, who were like his advisors. Their job was to give him good advice and give him good counsel. And so you're reading about basically Solomon's personal advisor here. And then one other one. What other one? Yeah, the guy who was over the tribute or the labor force, right? He was basically the person who was in charge of overseeing the king's projects, you might say, the building projects that he would have. He was overseeing the labor, overseeing the money that was involved in it, also be collecting tribute or taxes in order to pay for it. So it's kind of interesting to look at the different positions of leadership that Solomon, in all his great wisdom, the men that he appointed to those different offices. And then question number 2. Well, let's read verse 7 here. It says, "And Solomon had 12 officers over all Israel, which provided victuals for the king and his household. Each man his month in a year made provisions." So question number 2, and of course down through verse 19, that's just the list of those men in the area or division, province, you might say, that they were in charge of. But what was Solomon's system for keeping his household supplied throughout the entire year?
Each of these governors took a month and they supplied whatever he required.
Yeah, so basically, when Solomon began to reign, he took the kingdom, he divided it up into 12 regions, you might say. He put a guy in charge of each region, and his job was, during the year, to provide 1 month's worth of provisions from his region for the king's household. Now, what kind of provisions are we talking about here? Talking about a hamburger every day or something like that? I don't know if they had hamburger back then, but
Everything. Verse 22, there's
Flour, meal, fresh.
Verse 22.
yeah. So let's turn over here toward the end of the chapter and read some of these things that the household or the palace of Solomon required. And remember, it was the job of these officers to collect enough supplies from this region to supply the palace for 1 month. For an entire month, they had to feed all these people that were involved with Solomon and his reign. So let's go down to verse 26. Somebody read verses 26 through 28 for us.
Solomon had 40,000 soldiers and horses for his chariots, and 12,000 horsemen. And those officers provided victuals for King Solomon and for all that came unto King Solomon's table. Every man in his month, they lacked nothing. Barley also and straw for the horses and dromedaries brought they into the place where the officers were, every man according to his charge.
So we learn from that, not only were they responsible for supplying the food for humans, but they were also responsible for supplying all the supplies for the animals that Solomon owned or that were under his overseeing for that particular month. And then it was mentioned, let's back up here, let's read verses 22 and 23. Somebody read that for us.
Now Solomon's provision for 1 day was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fatted oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl.
Okay, so that kind of gives us a little bit of an idea of 1 day's provision for Solomon's palace. And what we read about here, we read about, well, it took 30 measures of fine flour. Version she was reading from actually translates the original Hebrew word cord. Does anybody have any idea how much that is?
I think it's bushels.
Okay, a bushel. Well,
It says
that's,
330 bushels and 660 bushels. I don't know how much bushels.
yeah, that's a good idea.
6 1/4 bushels?
Okay, so, I did a little bit of research and to kind of relate it to something that we can understand. If you study this Hebrew measure, was basically it took what was it, 10 ephahs to make a measure. Okay, and I know that doesn't help us any to get back to this idea, but if you look at what an ephah was, it took 10 omers to make an ephah. Now, this is where you can relate or understand a little bit. Does anybody remember whenever God gave the children of Israel manna from heaven, how much they gathered for a day? Turn over to Exodus 16:36 real quickly.
Over a tenth of an ephah.
Okay, and back up a little bit, do a little bit of reading there. What do you find that they gathered? Yeah, 1 omer. Every day, one person got 1 omer per day of manna. That was their ration for the day. He just read verse 36. An omer is the 10th part of an ephah. So it took 10 omers to make an ephah, which means, if we're going by people, that would have fed 10 people, right? So 1 ephah would have fed 10 people. It takes 10 ephahs to make 1 measure. Okay, so what is 1 measure? Does anybody do the math in their head?
Is this algebra?
No, it's not algebra, just basic addition. Multiplication, I'll make it better. Yeah, 100. So 1 measure would basically feed 100 people, right? So how many measures are we reading about here? 30 measures. So how many people would that feed? About 3,000 people. So that was just the fine flour. You also read about the meal. It was 60 measures. So that would have fed how many? About 6,000. So just the meal and the flour in and of itself would have fed, if you're measuring by the measurement of manna that the children of Israel got per day, it would have fed 1 person for the entire day. So that's right there, you're already up to 9,000 people. And then that's not even counting the meat. Then you got the 10 oxen that you read about that were fattened, the 20 that came out of the pasture, the 100 sheep. Then you had all this wild game too that went along with it. So, how many people are we talking about? We're talking about a lot of people. Scholars have estimated in the area anywhere from 15,000 to 24,000 people that were fed every day at Solomon's table. So you read that and you can kind of understand why Solomon divided the kingdom up the way that he did and put these guys in charge of feeding his palace for just 1 month. It would have been a big job, to feed them for an entire year. But it gives you a little bit of an idea of just how much it required. That was 1 day, 1 day's provision for the house of Solomon. Now, question number 3 is an interesting question, or add to the discussion a little bit. Why is it such a big job to provide provisions for a king or, a head of a state or, any high up official, we might say? Let's just say the President of the United States, because we can understand that, right? Would it be a big job if the President of the United States was coming to eat at your house? Why?
Security,
Okay. Security?
It's
What?
a huge cost.
food I can
Well,
have.
you're not gonna have a yard there.
Yeah. What are you going to eat? I mean, go pull out a bologna sandwich and say, here you go.
The top goes to the,
So you're saying he should have the best?
Well, I'm saying that probably we would provide it with the best that we had. I think that's just the natural human reaction. And so when you read about Solomon here, you know, Solomon is, he's not just one person. You got to feed. I mean, these regions were feeding, you know, this household for an entire month.
not only do they have to worry about feeding that household for a entire month, they still have to have enough provisions to feed themselves.
Yeah, yeah. So it was, you know, we read about Solomon, we talk about how great of a person Solomon was, but listen, he was an expensive king, wasn't he? I mean, you paid for what you got. It was this, remember when God warned Israel about establishing a king, what did he warn them about?
Taxes.
Yeah, he's going to take all these things, you know, the best of everything that you have away from him. But I see in this part of a fulfillment of that and that burden that's being laid upon the people in providing for the king and his household.
That was part of what Elijah did afterwards. They said, your dad's been taxing fire out of us, lighting us up. He said, no, not so, why I do it, and that's what I'm.
Yeah. So it was, you know, again, it's not to minimize Solomon or his wisdom or the extent of his kingdom. It was amazing. But it came at a price too. I mean, Israel was paying for this on their own, and like Adam said, you know, it's seen whenever his son tries to ascend to the throne. The request of the people was to lighten the load. You know, take some of this tribute or these taxes off of us. So let's go down. Anybody got any comments or questions there on those first 19 verses? Yes, sir.
Well, back up here in verse 4, it says Abathar had listed him as a priest, but he kicked him out.
Yeah, and I think that was probably something that happened a little bit later on.
After this,
Yeah, well, you know he was there under the reign of David, right? He was in that position. So he was removed whenever Solomon ascends to the throne. So he's listed in there, but he was removed from that office. Yeah, he wasn't there very long, was he? Anybody else? Okay, let's go down to verse 21 or verse 20. And if I can't get let's get somebody to read verses 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 20 through 28 for us.
Judah and Israel were many as the sand, which is by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and making merry. And Solomon reigned over all the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, and in the border of Egypt, where they brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life. And Solomon's provision for one day was 30 measures of fine flour, and 80 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen, and 20 oxen out of the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides harts and roebucks and fallow deer and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tishah even unto Azov, over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on all sides around about him. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and those officers provided victuals for Solomon and for all that came unto King Solomon's table. Every man in his mouth they lacked nothing. Barley also and straw for the horses, dromedaries brought they into the place where the officers were, every man according to his charge.
Okay, so question number 4 is we're reading about you know, the extent or the condition, I guess we should say, of the kingdom during Solomon's reign. What were some of the way that the people and and I guess we could say we do too, measure prosperity. What were some of the conditions described here that described to us the prosperity that existed during Solomon's reign in Israel and in Judah?
Eating and drinking.
Okay, so there was plenty of food, right? Nobody was lacking, nobody was going hungry, nobody was starving, suffering from famine, things like that. What else do you read about?
They were rejoicing.
Okay, did
were
they,
happy.
I mean, if you've got lots of money and you got lots of food, are people generally happy? Yeah, I mean, that's the condition that everybody wants today, right? We don't want hard times, we want prosperity. What else do you read about?
Peace on all sides.
Peace, right? One of the conditions of Solomon's reign, or one of the situations, was they weren't being attacked by all these different enemies. What was it like under Saul's reign? I mean, they were constantly fighting with the Philistines, weren't they? They were constantly at war. But there was a great time of peace that the people enjoyed. What else do you read about? Tribute? Okay. So, we mentioned the idea of taxes, right? They were paying taxes, but there were a lot of other nations that were paying tribute too. A lot of other people that were pouring money into Israel also. Any other ones stand out? Okay, so did they like Solomon being their king? Yeah, I mean, again, you go from the conditions under Saul and David. You know, it wasn't. He was a good king, but the conditions under his rule weren't near as good as under Solomon's too, physically speaking. So they were happy to serve Solomon. Anybody mention the idea of territory? You know, it reads about the expanse of the kingdom, how it spreads to its largest, its borders are expanded to its largest place under the rule of Solomon, you know, fulfilling the promise that God made to Abraham. So there's a lot of measures that are mentioned here of the prosperity of Israel and Judah that they enjoyed. Verse 25, though, and Dennis mentioned this, what was one of the key national blessings during Solomon's lifetime? Yeah, peace or safety, right? Why is peace, question 6 here, why is peace one of the greatest blessings that a nation can enjoy?
With the trade.
Okay, lack of fear.
For the Israelites, though, it's safety just because they were always going to war.
Yeah, a break from fighting. You know, they had been fighting since they got there, hadn't they? Since they entered into the promised land.
Without it, you can't enjoy the other blessings.
Yeah, if you're living in a nation that is at war with somebody, does that affect you personally? Sure. You know, one of the verses in the Old Testament, turn over to Jeremiah chapter 29 with me real quickly. This is a verse that pops into my mind a lot when we're talking about the idea of enjoying national peace, enjoying living in a land where people aren't fighting with each other and aren't at war with each other. But this is actually, these are the words of Jeremiah that were written to some of the people who were carried away into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar. And remember that the message that Jeremiah is bringing to them in chapter 29 is basically get comfortable. I mean, you're going to be there a while. It's not something that you're going to come out of quickly. You know, you got 70 years of captivity to endure before you ever return back to Israel. So he tells them, if you look at verse 6, he says, you know, take wives, have children, bear sons and daughters. And then in verse 7, he says this, though. He says, and seek the peace of the city, whither I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray unto the Lord for it. For in the peace thereof shall ye have peace. So what was he saying to the Israelites here?
Be at peace where you're at.
Yeah, he said you conduct yourself in such a way to help this nation be at peace. You know, and you pray to God. you pray to God that this nation will be at peace. And the reason was what? If they're at peace, you're at peace, right? If they're at war, you're at war. And so one of the greatest blessings that any nation can experience under the rule of anyone is a time of peace. Because if that nation's at peace, then that means that the people are at peace also. So that was, again, an unusual situation compared to the reign of Saul and the reign of David, because the people enjoyed a very prosperous and very peaceful time. Let's go to verse 29. Get somebody to go back here to 1 Kings chapter 4, and somebody read verse 29 through the rest of the chapter for us.
And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding, exceedingly much, and largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore. And Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country, and all the wisdom of Egypt, where he was wiser than all the men, than Ethan, Ezra, Heman, and Charcoal, and Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was in all nations round about. And he spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And he spake of trees, from the cedar tree that was in Lebanon, even unto the Hipsah, the springeth out of the wall. He spake also of beasts, of fowl, and of creeping things, and of fishes. And there came all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom.
Okay, so we're reading about, we read last week or studied about this gift that Solomon asked of God, and that was the gift of wisdom. And question number 7 here is the question, what was God's primary gift to Solomon? You know, it's defined in a lot of different ways, but if you really had to kind of put it down into simple terms that everybody would understand, how would you describe that? What was his gift?
Sparks got ever lived.
Okay. You know, it was, I was trying to think of a really good word to describe it. And to me, the word that helped me understand it the best is insight. I mean, God gave Solomon all this insight. Now, he wanted insight for what particular reason? Yeah, to rule the nation, right? And so God gave him the insight for governing a kingdom, what he needed to govern a kingdom. But was that all the wisdom that he gave him? Was that all the insight that he gave him? No, he was like Adam said, he was one smart dude. I mean, he knew about the inside, about everything that there was. And that was God's gift to him. So how did Solomon, question number 8, how did Solomon's wisdom compare to the wisest men of his day? Right, we read about some of those men, the wise men that lived then and there.
Well, he was wiser than all of them, but also he had along with wisdom, he had understanding, largeness of heart.
Yes.
So he understood his people.
Yeah.
He understood what their needs were, and he cared.
Yeah, and I mean, you think about it, what does a good leader need? Those are qualities, right? That's what Solomon was asking for. You know, this insight to govern this great nation. What are the qualities? The qualities that I need to rule this nation in a way that you want me to. And God, again, he not only gave him that, he gave him insight into everything else too. And so, like you said, when you compared him with the people of his day and age, it wasn't even a comparison. I mean, he knew more than any of these other guys that we read about. And remember that the promise that God made to Solomon back in chapter 3. Look back in chapter 3 real quickly here. And a couple verses 12 and 13. But remember, God says to him, "Behold, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and an understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. And I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days." So God's promise was, just like Adam said, he was the smartest guy in the world. Not only that, but he was the smartest guy to ever live. God said it's not going to be anybody like you before, not going to be anybody like you after. You're going to be the smartest of all the kings to ever live. So the wisdom that he had, I know when we talk about Solomon, we think, well, God gave him the wisdom to rule over a kingdom, and he did, but it wasn't just that. I mean, he knew everything about anything. And it was amazing for all these people to come and be able to sit at the feet of Solomon and to hear about his insight into to all of these different things. So what were, we read about some of those, and question number 9 here, what were some of the intellectual things that Solomon knew about, or the intellectual accomplishments that he had, this knowledge? What were some areas that we read about?
Proverbs,
Okay, what's a proverb?
where he would give an example of maybe more of a context in a heavenly manner, kind of like a parable to some degree, but of something that was going to happen and would happen if these other things happened
Okay.
in the sequence. You know, if
How,
you have peace, with your neighbor, if all your neighbors have peace,
Yeah.
you'll have peace.
yeah, so they're tidbits of wisdom, right? And they're sayings. You know, a proverb is usually a saying. It's something that sticks around. You know, we have different wise sayings that carry with them wisdom. Well, like look before you leap. I mean, is that a proverb? Yeah, it's a wise saying, right? It carries some application, some wisdom to it. So how many of these did Solomon have?
3,000.
3,000. Can you imagine that? 3,000 of these wise sayings or wise phrases like we speak today. What else do you read about? What were some of the other areas?
Science,
Okay, science. What do you know about?
ask it the other way.
Yeah, everything, right? What didn't he know about? You know, he knew all about animals, or you want to talk about birds or reptiles, or you know, whatever beast you want to talk about, Solomon could talk about. You want to talk about fish? He knew all about aquatic life. You know, just birds is another one that's mentioned there. The fowl of the air. Just any animal or plant. You want to talk about this great cedar tree or the smallest little plant that existed on the face of the earth at that time, Solomon could tell you all about. And so his insight, his knowledge of all these different things was just unbelievable. It was unfathomable that a person could know everything about anything. But that was the gift that God gave Solomon. I don't think we often think about it, but he was a poet too, wasn't he? He was involved in writing poetry. How many of those we read about? Yeah, most of them were put into songs. A lot of the poetry back then was put into songs. So there was 1,005. Just think about writing 1,005. I don't know who the greatest composer, you know, in human history has been, and how many pieces they wrote. But Solomon wrote 1,005. I mean, that's unbelievable, isn't it? So again, I think sometimes when we think about Solomon's wisdom, we think, well, it was just something that God gave him to rule over the kingdom. No, it was everything about anything. And Solomon knew all these things. We'll skip over 10 because we're running out of time here. What was the response of other kings when they heard of Solomon's wisdom?
Heard of it, I think a lot of them thought that some of it was smoke. They wanted to go see it for themselves. They all said when they saw it, it wasn't smoke.
Yeah. So I think the first step was you read about all these people in verse 34 that come to hear the wisdom of Solomon. So, you know, if this king's over here ruling, he hears about this other king, he says, hey, go over here and check this out. You know, go ask him this question. See if he knows anything about it. Or go lay to him this situation, you know, and see if he can solve it. And so a lot of people, I think, came to Solomon with questions. They came to him with tests. They came to him, you know, asking for a report on certain things. I mean, you wanted to know how to grow a crop better. What you can do to improve it, go ask Solomon. So there were a lot of people that came, and eventually a lot of these royal rulers came themselves. We're going to read about the Queen of Sheba a little later on, but a lot of them came themselves to they just couldn't believe. They just couldn't believe that one person could possess this much insight into all these different things.
Well, you know, it could validate the king too, not only by having the question answered, but it could validate when he went back to his people, he could say, Solomon said.
There you go. Yeah, that's what they used to play instead of Simon Says, right? Solomon Says. Okay. Anybody else have any questions or comments before we end? We're out of time. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, he was. Yeah, I think as we read about him and study him a little bit more, he had a good personality. You know, a little later on in life, he went the wrong direction, but he ended up changing that. But I think he was a very humble individual, and I don't think he let all that knowledge go to his head. And that would be part of being a good ruler and king, over Israel too. But that's a very good point. Anybody else?